This video will be on the evolution unit, learning targets 12 and 13, looking specifically at speciation. And so to talk about speciation, we need to define again what a species is. And a species is a group of similar organisms that reproduce to make fertile offspring. Here, these Ewoks reproduce with other Ewoks and make more Ewoks. They don't reproduce with Wookiees and make some sort of hybrid that is able to live on its own. Again, a species only reproduces with itself. And so that leads us to speciation, or the formation of new species. There are many things that can cause the formation of new species over time. We're going to look at two types of speciation here, allopatric and sympatric speciation. First, allopatric speciation. The word allo means different, and patric means homeland, coming from the word patria, like patriot, means like homeland. And so think different homeland. If you go up here to this first, you see one species of tree. Well, a ravine kind of forms in between, maybe over several thousand years, and you have the formation of two different species. This is where members of the same species become isolated from one another, and this leads to speciation. Usually this is geographically, but this could be something different. And sympatric speciation is where members of the same species still live together, but for whatever reason, they're no longer reproducing with one another. This could be polyploidy, like we'll look at in learning targets 14 and 15. This could be several other factors that we'll look at, several other reproductive barriers that we'll look at. And so what is well, here's a couple of examples of this. First, allopatric speciation. Example of this, the Grand Canyon there formed over thousands of years. Well, before it formed, there was a species of squirrel that lived peacefully on both shores of the Grand Canyon. But as the Colorado River cut deeper and deeper, those two species were no longer able to reach one another, or that one species was no longer able to cross the river and reach the squirrels on the other side. And so what happened is they became two different species. They were isolated from one another geographically and became two different species. Sympatric speciation. See this in plants a lot. There are some examples of this happening in animals. Cichlids are these little fish that live in Africa, in Lake Victoria. And one of the theories concerning cichlids, there may be 50 different kinds of cichlids in this lake or more. And the idea is, well, maybe several thousand years ago, Lake Victoria dried up and left these little pockets of water. Well, each little pocket of water had a particular way of getting food that was good. Well, maybe it was to eat fish or to eat snails or algae or whatever, and you can see these different fish. Well, Lake Victoria fills back up rather quickly, and you have all these different species of fish that come from one common ancestor. And so the idea is that they developed all in the same area rather quickly, as far as evolution is concerned, but yet all come from this one species of cichlid. And so what are some different reproductive barriers? We're going to categorize them into two categories: pre-zygotic barriers and post-zygotic barriers. Pre-zygotic barriers being those barriers that happen before fertilization occurs. Remember, zygote is a fertilized egg. And so before fertilization, before the animals are able to mate, these are barriers that keep them from mating, that keep them from being in physical contact with one another. Post-zygotic barriers are after they have mated, after the zygote has been formed. There are other barriers that keep that resultant offspring from being its own species. And we call this reproductive isolation. This is when there's the separation of species so that they can no longer produce, they can no longer make fertile offspring. Here's a picture of an owl, and this owl, maybe several thousand years ago, was one species. Well, what do you have here in this area of the United States? You have deserts, you have mountains, Gandalf, and over time, these owls separated. They're no longer mating this side of in California, Oregon, Washington, is no longer mating with Southwest United States and Mexico, and you have two reproductively isolated populations, and they speciate. They become two separate species. So now we're going to look at 5 different kinds of reproductive isolation. A little RI, that's what that means, hopefully helping you with your outline. The first kind is temporal isolation. Temporal in this case means time. This is a pre-zygotic barrier because they're not mating. Groups become isolated because they reproduce at different times of the day. Maybe one of them is nocturnal, the other one's diurnal, which means active during the day. Or they reproduce at different times of the year. So here's an example of frogs. Some frogs reproduce during the day, others at night. Some reproduce in the early spring, like the upland chorus frog there on the left. Some reproduce in the summer, like the green frog there on the right, or the leopard frog there on the right. And some species reproduce in different times of the year. Elk reproduce in the early fall. White-tailed deer reproduce in the early winter. And so they never see one another. They're never interested in mating at the same time. So that's temporal isolation. Habitat isolation. This is where groups become isolated. This is a pre-zygotic barrier, by the way. Groups become isolated because they live in different habitats. Habitat is the place where an organism lives. They live in different habitats. For instance, a snake can live on the ground, and another type of snake lives in the water or is active in the water. These two types of snakes don't come in contact with one another, and so they are reproductively isolated. Maybe a mutation causes a type of snake to no longer desire being in the water. Well, it becomes isolated, reproduces, spreads that gene on, and so forth. And again, you have 2 different species. So this can happen over many different generations. Behavioral isolation. This is a pre-zygotic barrier. This is where groups become isolated because they develop different behaviors associated with reproduction. Here you have blue-footed boobies. They have different dances in order to attract their mates. Different kinds of boobies have different kinds of dances that are going to attract their own mate. They recognize each other by the kind of dance that they do. And so just to go a little bit deeper here on behavior, because behavior is one of these things that we don't normally associate with our DNA, but there are some behaviors that are coded for on our DNA, and these are called innate behaviors. These are behaviors that we don't have to learn. They're ones that we are born with. Kittens know how to nurse from their mother when they're born. You don't have to teach a baby kitten to go and find its mother and to nurse. You don't have to teach them to huddle together to stay warm. These are innate behaviors, just like the courtship dances of the blue-footed boobies. These are innate behaviors. If these behaviors change, then speciation likely will occur because these behaviors are coded for on the DNA. That's different than learned behavior. For instance, some cats can learn to turn on the faucet. This is not an innate behavior in cats. Cats haven't had faucets for the many thousands and millions of years that they've been evolving. But some cats have faucets now because they live indoors and they've learned to turn the water on to get a drink. This is a learned behavior. Perhaps another cat can watch them and learn from another cat, but it's not going to be imprinted on their DNA how to use faucets. It's just not. It's not even imprinted on human DNA on how to use a faucet. Now, that brings us to a more complicated issue, something like migration. Migration, of course, is when these animals fly long distances or move long distances. Well, is migration a learned behavior or an innate behavior? This is one that has components of both. Birds, migratory birds, have a innate sense of it's time to go someplace. It's winter, I need to fly. They may even have an innate sense of how to navigate, meaning how to look at the stars and how to follow the magnetic poles and these things that we don't even notice. However, a bird does not come born with a map to Brazil on its DNA. It has to follow other birds in order to learn how to get there. And so migration is a great example of a behavior that has both. And many behaviors in nature have both elements. And so another reproductive isolation is geographic isolation. This is a pre-zygotic barrier. These groups become isolated because of geography, islands, mountains, whatever. These Hawaiian finches were isolated from one another because as new islands formed, as new volcanoes erupted in Hawaii, these groups become isolated. The islands have very different characters, and so they develop different ways of feeding. And from one ancestral finch, very similar to Darwin's finches in Galapagos, you have many that are around today. And our only example of a post-zygotic barrier is hybrid sterility. This is where groups become isolated because their offspring cannot reproduce to create fertile offspring. So the male zebra and the female donkey make forever alone zonkey here. Well, zonkey is sterile. A zonkey can't find another zonkey and make babies. They're sterile. So therefore, a donkey and a zebra are two different species. They may mate when they're put together in a cage or whatever, but they're not going to produce a new species of animal because donkeys are sterile and they are not viable. And so this is the only post-zygotic barrier. There are others, particularly having to do with hybrids, but we're going to stay at hybrid sterility as our only example of a post-zygotic barrier.